In this new series from N.T. Wright Online, we're looking at the transformative elements of our Christian faith and how we are to think uniquely about them and let them transform our lifestyle. From the very beginning of the Christian way, people who are following Jesus have broken bread together and have interpreted that as a sign of his presence and his purpose and a reminder of all that he has done and of all that he will do. They have used different expressions to talk about what they were doing. At the beginning, they simply talked about breaking bread, and Paul talks about this as the bread breaking, as though that's becoming almost a technical term. But then he also calls it the Lord's Supper, remembering the Last Supper which Jesus had with his disciples, but now it becomes the supper of the Lord. The word supper is now more of an older English word in that sense and may not suit our purposes as well, but bread breaking will do. Other traditions, of course, have given it other names. Often in my tradition, we call it the Eucharist. Eucharist simply means the thank you meal. In Roman Catholic circles, it's referred to as the Mass because at the end of the Catholic service in Latin, the presiding priest says, Missa est, there is a sending out, you are sent out, and Missa was constructed into Mass, as though referring to the whole service. And so we call it different things, but it's basically the same event. It is meeting together as Jesus' family to break bread, to share wine, and to tell once again the story of the night he was betrayed, the day he went to his death, and of his glorious resurrection. And one of the most important things to say about this is that when Jesus wanted to explain to his first followers what his forthcoming death was going to be all about, he didn't give them a theory, he gave them a meal. This meal, the meal of which he said, do this in remembrance of me. Now the word remembrance, that's tricky. It doesn't just mean have a vague memory of a past event. It means allow that past event to become present so that just as Jews at the Passover feast would think of themselves as being the same people who came out of Egypt on that night, and now they are here on their way still next year in Jerusalem and all that. So Christians following Jesus are to see themselves as one with the disciples around the table, with Jesus breaking the bread and sharing the wine. So Jesus giving them this meal was therefore not just an interpretation of his own forthcoming death, it was the means by which people could share in it. People today will often talk in terms of sharing Jesus' death and resurrection by faith. That has good New Testament pedigree as well. But the idea of living as a Christian without breaking the bread and sharing the wine does seem to almost all Christians throughout history almost a contradiction in terms. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:26, when you do this, you are announcing, proclaiming the death of the Lord until he comes. And when Paul says that, I don't think he means that when you are celebrating the Eucharist, you should also have a sermon talking about Jesus' death. Well, you might well, but that's not actually what he means. He means that doing it says it, that breaking the bread together, telling that story of Jesus going to his death, and sharing the bread and the wine together is a way of announcing to the principalities and powers, not just to the few people who may be in church at the moment, but to the world around, that the Jesus who died on the cross and is raised from the dead is the Lord, and he is present and he is at work. And so the Eucharist becomes, in much Christian tradition, a way of expressing our unity with God's purposes for all creation. Holy Communion becomes a focal point in the present of God's promise for the future. I'm thinking of passages like Isaiah 11 or Psalm 72 about the whole earth being full of the glory of the Lord, or of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. That's a strange passage which I haven't often heard taught, but I think it means this, that eventually God intends to flood all creation with his presence. And the language that Jesus himself used, "This is my body, this is my blood," has been interpreted in ways which I think are best understood as that when you take this bread, when you share this wine, for a moment and in the context of the service, these things become anticipations of the time when the earth is full of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. It remains mysterious. There isn't a kind of a chemical change in the bread or anything like that, but they become vehicles, vessels of God's future given to be the food which sustains us and guides us and directs us in the present. They become vehicles and vessels, in other words, of the life of Jesus himself. Therefore, as we do this, as we break the bread, as we drink the wine, two things are happening with time itself. God's ultimate future is coming forwards into the present, and we are enjoying it ahead of time, fleetingly, no doubt. And God's past, the events of Jesus' death and resurrection, they are coming forwards from the past to meet us as well, so that every time we do this, we are at a place where past and future intersect and interlock and give us a kind of anchorage. We are who we are because we do this in remembrance of him. As a result, there is a special intimacy about this meal, and many Christians down the years have found this, even if it's hard to put into words, a sense that in telling the story of Jesus and in receiving the bread and in sharing the wine, we are meeting Jesus in person. And Jesus, equally important, is meeting us. I remember one older member of the congregation where I was growing up when I was a boy telling me that he made a practice every time he went to communion of going up, receiving the bread and the wine as the presence of Jesus, coming back to his seat and then reading again the gospel reading which had been read as part of the earlier bit of the service, expecting that the Jesus who he had just met in bread and wine would speak to him afresh through that gospel reading. And I remember him saying, and if he says you need to do this, then be sure you do it. In other words, when you're meeting Jesus, this is not simply a comforting experience, though it may be that. It is about giving direction and shape to your life. So how often should we break the bread and drink the wine together? Some traditions have seen a daily Eucharist, a daily Mass, as the ideal. And I found when I was working in regular pastoral work that often the daily Eucharist was something that sustained me, and I was able to do that even if there were only 2 or 3 people there, and it was an anchor in the pastoral work that I was doing. Some have now gone to the other extreme, and some in the part of Scotland that I know best will often celebrate communion simply once a year. That, to me, growing up, would have seemed extraordinary, but for those who do it, it's incredibly special because they build up to it. They take days, if not weeks, to prepare. We are going to have a communion Sunday, and so get ready. So prepare your heart and mind for this great moment. And that, in a way, is taking it every bit as seriously as those who have a daily Eucharist. Some, perhaps I'm a typical Anglican, prefer now to have a weekly communion, sometimes more, but certainly Sunday by Sunday. The day of resurrection is a day to meet the risen Lord in the breaking of bread. I think the most important thing, though, is that it should be regular, not just sporadic, not just I feel like doing it this week. The regular habit of knowing that one is coming to this breaking of bread, to this meeting with Jesus, is the real thing to aim at, however frequently that may be. Because the service of Holy Communion forms and shapes communities. I found that when I've been in regular active ministry, taking a communion service and meeting people at the door afterwards, having a sense that they have just been through the great drama which is God's story with the world, God's story with Jesus. And it brings our whole life into that story so that we go out from church having had the story of the rest of our lives reshaped in subtle ways or more vivid ways by what's just happened. I remember one time a colleague, when I was working as a college chaplain, what Americans would call campus ministry, and a colleague who was not a believing Christian, he said, how do you cope when people come and dump all their problems on you, and day by day you're getting all this stuff and difficulties and pains and horrors that are going on in people's lives? And I said, well, you know that building round the corner, which we call the chapel? And he said, yes. I said, well, day by day, I go into that building and I bring all those problems and pains and puzzles with me. And I said, we do this thing where we break the bread and we pour out the wine, and somehow all those pains and puzzles, they are there on the table. And something about breaking the bread, drinking the wine, and then sharing it deals with them. Not that we now know all the answers, we don't, but we are now equipped again because we have brought them into the presence of Jesus and into the action which Jesus gave as the means of interpreting his death. And it's his death and his resurrection which ultimately will be the clue to all our pains and puzzles. Please feel free to click the link to watch the next video in this sequence.